Hi, everybody. This is Isaac. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Today, I'm talking with Ben Dueholm, a pastor who had been serving in Illinois but is now in Texas. Uh, I guess about 2 years ago now, Ben wrote a book called Sacred Signposts that some of you read with me at the church. And so today, Ben and I are going to talk about what it's like being a pastor during the pandemic and just some of the themes from his book, talk about the sacraments, the future of the church. It should be a pretty wide-ranging discussion. But first, I want to let Ben tell you more about himself. Thanks for joining us today, Ben.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you for having me. Yeah, as you said, I was a pastor for um, about 10 years in Chicago and in the Chicago area. Came down to the Dallas area late last year and have been serving here since. In addition to the book I wrote that you mentioned, Sacred Signposts, I've written for a number of magazines and journals over the years on all kinds of topics, many of them relating to worship and some of them not, but liturgical practice and theology is a big part of what I do and write about, and this has been a pretty interesting time to think about some of those things for sure.
Yeah, so let's just jump into that. What is your church doing right now? Are you having online services? Like, how are you adapting to everything that's going on?
We are having online services. We had one Sunday of overlap where we did have the church building open, although people were already being discouraged, from going out if they were, had a complicating factor. Um, and so we had some people in the sanctuary, and we streamed our worship service for the first time. We had never done that before. And in fact, I had never done that before in any church I'd served. So that was a new experience for me and for the congregation. And then after that, that was March 15th. And then starting that week with our Wednesday night Lent Vespers, and then last Sunday and going forward, we've done only streaming, and that's been a good experience in a way, because while it's not what anybody necessarily wanted to do, people have responded well to it, and they've been patient as we figured out how to make it work well. You take a camera that's designed for a meeting room and put it on a whole sanctuary, and you've only got one angle, and you have to kind of build the plane while you're flying it, and I think that's been true for a whole lot of clergy and a whole lot of churches lately.
Yeah, we have not had a history of doing that either. And we've been using my iPhone to record ours instead of streaming live, and then I've kind of pieced them together in iMovie and posted
Uh,
them later. So um, it's definitely been interesting. But the feedback, you're right, has been good. One person um, who will probably watch this and then laugh, but shall remain nameless, told me that online church may just be the way to move forward. So we might be working ourselves out of a job, Ben.
yeah, that thought has occurred to me. Yeah, that has occurred to me.
But that question of online, I think, gets to the heart of a lot of what you talk about in your book, and
Yeah.
also a lot of the discussions the clergy and churches are having right now about um, what is different about worship or even the sacraments when you can't be together in person.
Right.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, we can, it's up to you. We can take a more broad approach and talk about what does incarnational ministry mean right now, or we can just jump right into like the debate about things like online communion or something like that.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it in kind of the broader perspective, because I think that's you can get yourself into some bad spots if you build your liturgical theology around solving a short-term problem.
Hmm.
And that's something that I've tried to keep in mind, through all this. And really, going back before we had, to do social distancing and closing down church buildings and so forth, we've always had to kind of answer the the question of what do you really need for this to work?
Mm.
You know, what makes it count? What makes it valid? You know, to put it in the term of sacramental theology. What makes a sacrament valid? What makes a worshiping community a community? I actually, you know, I came across, before I came down here, churches where I was invited to be candidate, where they had drive-in worship, and that was something that I had to ask myself, you know, could I actually do that?
Describe what
Or
that
did I
means,
think that
though.
was,
They
what's
did
that?
that. Can you describe what that means? They did something like that regularly?
Yeah, I think it was. I don't remember the exact details, but I want to say it was seasonal. It was during a
Okay.
time of the year where they would just for one service, or maybe for one season, people would just drive up, and church would be from your car. And there is a way in which convenience, or a certain conception of distance and safety, can shape these practices in a really unhealthy way, right? You know, I think that's something that people in my position, a lot of us would have assumed or taken for granted, or insisted on, you know, not that long ago. And so there's something about a corporate being, in a literally corporate, not a virtually corporate gathering. The sense of having to share the same space, of having to encounter each other without antiseptic barriers, in a way that is, you know, more important to Christian worship and Christian community than words on a page or things we do together at the same time. You know, there is a history of dispersed worship going all the way back, when daily worship happened, you know, at the morning and evening forum bells or whatever, and people would pray at noon or fast, you know, in their homes. It's not like that's new, but that was always centered around the church being gathered. You know, the synagogue, the ecclesia, these words for being gathered together or called out in a way that suggests actual togetherness. And I think that has a big impact on the whole shape of worship and sacramental theology and sacramental practice, that you can't, you know, remote control baptize people. You can't, you know, I think Thomas Aquinas deals with the question of whether a priest could consecrate all the wine in a wine cellar. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and I think his answer was yes. Like clearly he shouldn't, but he could. But he couldn't consecrate all the wine in the world. You know, you had to be, you know, there was a certain kind of proximity that needed to happen for that. And as much or as little as you want to heed that, I think the idea that these things do require togetherness in a fairly literal way is important. It's an important part of what we do as Christians. It's an important part of the kind of physical solidarity that comes from worshiping together.
Yeah, so I think that um, that question of validity, then, when we think about online communion, is, you know, I think that it's a lot of the framing that I've seen of it in discussions of clergy is like whether or not it's valid or like theologically possible to
Right,
bless elements through a screen or through the
right,
internet. But what I hear you saying is more about, it's not, that's maybe not the right way to frame the question as much as it is it, um, even if it's like possible to do that, is that giving up some sort of fundamental element of what it means to be the body of Christ in the sacraments?
right, right. No, and I think that I am sort of fascinated by questions of sacramental validity, but in a way that's almost the way I'm fascinated by questions over who was the greatest basketball player of all time or whatever, you know, by what statistics you want to measure. It's an interesting question, but it's also, I think, a deceptive way to look at it. because what if you end up looking for what is the precise formula, what is the minimum we need in order for this to work, you're already kind of getting off the path of what is this supposed to do for us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you've got an ordained person on one side of a camera, and you've got elements, in people's homes. Is that enough, or is that adequate? Well, my instinct is to say no, but I also can't cite chapter and verse on why exactly. But to me, it just seems like it's not what this was supposed to be. This was supposed to be originally one loaf, one bread, in the prayer in the Didache, that has made it into I think a Marty Haugen song, and into some of our worship resources. The
Yeah.
grains of wheat that were scattered upon the mountainside are gathered into one bread, into one loaf. So may all your people from all the ends of the world, your church scattered throughout the world, be gathered into one. That loaf, that celebrant host, or whatever it may be, is itself an act of unity. And if we parcel it out to such a degree that it can happen, in this totally sealed off way, maybe we're doing something else altogether.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting. If you want to think about kind of the mystical body of Christ that we, our liturgies, like we call it the Great Thanksgiving in the Methodist Church, but just for our audience sake, it's probably helpful to point out that Ben is Lutheran.
Right. Yeah, I probably should mention that.
Yeah. And we could get into Luther's essay on fleeing the plague later if you want.
Right.
But I think that, there's this notion of like, okay, what are the individual pieces of Christ's body in time, in creation? And typically that's talked about as like a church by itself is an individual piece, and not like, and not like, oh, Ben is one piece by himself within this larger body. Like, it's broken down. Like, so there are all these different churches, they make up of the body of Christ. And then when you go down, one microscope level into that, then there are all these congregants within those churches that make up that part of the body. And so it's interesting to think about, when we do kind of say, when we think about our life, our spiritual life, I think most of us in America have been trained to think about ourselves as an individual unit. And yet Jesus's promise of presence in gathering starts with a plurality, right? When two or three are gathered. So I think it's sort of a challenge to a lot of the baseline assumptions of American Christianity to think about, okay, well, if we're truly thinking about faith as a totally private thing that you don't have to share with anyone, then maybe this screen relationship is enough.
Right.
Um, but when we're thinking about what exactly the church is, um, it seems to be predicated on this notion of gathering publicly.
Right. Right. And I think, the way that our practices have evolved in North America in particular, I don't think this has happened as much in other places, but I don't know. I should say I don't know. But the antiseptic, the germophobic element to Holy Communion comes in North America fairly early, some time ago. And you start having the pre-filled individual little shot glasses. And you have the little pre-broken, excuse me, as everybody's probably seen now, that you can even buy these in bulk, pre-sealed, little dose of grape juice with a little wafer on top, and it's all wrapped up together, and nobody else has to touch it. These practices that were meant to be hygienic, I think, explicitly meant to be hygienic, also had the probably unintended effect of physically physically sort of dosing the sacrament. Like, this
Yeah.
is your little bit of grace. You get this little shot glass, and you get this little crumb, and it's only yours. No one else, you don't need to see anyone else handling it. Um, and I think that understandably creates the perception in people that this is my bit of grace, and you are denying it to me if we cannot consecrate it, over the internet. Um, and I think that is a mistaken understanding, that you need to unwind that in order to get to the question of what can and can't you do, at a distance. That if this is in fact a little individual dose of grace, and the church is only the intermediary by which this dose of grace gets from God to you, then sure, who are we to say you can't just do this whenever, under whatever circumstances? If in fact it is a meal meant to be shared in community by community, not simply an individual interaction with God, then you have to think about how that is best and properly done, rather than what meets a minimum standard for giving us grace. And I do think the individual understanding of what a Christian has probably had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, and I think another aspect here that is worth pointing out is that, okay, so if we're sort of defining this in the negative, so, or at least the Eucharist in the negative, so if we're going to give a positive definition to it that is away from this sort of individualized view that we're critiquing, it's that when we do come to the Lord's table, that there's this great, unification happening through the power of the grace that we're receiving, so that we all become one in Jesus Christ, and the distinctions between us, uh, melt away. That, especially that Paul talks about very powerfully,
Right.
um, and that we become not only united with those around us in a way that we aren't when we're not taking the sacraments, but also that we are united both with Christians of every time within the church, and also united
Right.
to Jesus in the historical event of his
Right.
passion.
Right.
Ultimately, it's about, okay, it's not just about like what God is going to do for us in this, but where we join God in time and
Right.
what we experience that Jesus has experienced. It's about sharing his death and resurrection in that meal. And I think that
Right.
we uh, we have a lot of that language in our liturgies, but I'm not quite sure that that's always something that people can suss out in the experience.
Absolutely. I think
Um,
that's absolutely right. There's one of the liturgies in the the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, has as part of the anaphora, unite us uh, to your Son in His sacrifice, or something like that. I'm not getting it quite right, but in other words, to say, make this moment the moment in which we are pulled up into that event. And I think that's very historic, and that's very ancient, and and you have to, at least I think you have to preach that. You have to catechize that, because the default for us, and this goes for clergy as much as anyone else, I think, is to treat a lot of these things as something like a consumer experience,
mhm.
and to sort of shape it that way, but looking at it as a moment where we do step out of ourselves, or step out of time. We become what we receive, and individually and corporately, we become transformed by this. It's not just a dose of grace. It is also it's being lifted up. It is being transformed. It is a bigger thing than I think a kind of sacramental minimalism has taught taught people to expect. And that does take work over time to not just practice it in a good way, but to preach it so that people expect more from it and more from themselves in it. But that being said, I think I think that is a case you can make, and I do think, part of the premise for my book is that practices, religious practices, are older and more deeply rooted than the explanations or the stories that are grafted onto them. We started celebrating the Lord's Supper together before the words of institution were included. There's centuries of Christian worship where the words of institution, so-called, are not used at all. There are stories that we tell that kind of come on later, but the practice itself is so eloquent and so it shapes people, regardless of what they think about it, so that it's there for you to already work with. You don't need to kind of start from the ground up with people's understanding of the Eucharist or of anything else. They're doing it because they love it, and all you need to do is help unfold that love in a bigger and broader way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that um, I've been in pastoral ministry in June, it'll be my beginning of my 5th year. And as I think about, the Christian message and what exactly it is that sets us apart, or what makes us who we are, or the identity of church, I think that, one of the things that I've started to, lock into more recently and over the past few years is this idea that Christians should be defined by what we do and what we don't do. There's this great Herman Melville story called Bartleby the Scrivener, where this guy, have you read it? Okay, but for those who haven't, it's a short story where a man who works in an office just comes into work one day and is told by his domineering boss to do something, and he just says, "I'd prefer not to," and he just keeps saying that over and over again until the boss completely transforms their office to create this space where Bartleby kind of exists in it, not doing anything. And I think that in some ways there's something very important about Christians saying, we're not going to do some things and that our culture will do. But at the same time, so I think that what I'm trying to say here is that ultimately, when we're in a time where people, I think there's a temptation to do a lot of policing about, what every individual person believes about things like communion, or about things like, especially in the Methodist Church right now, about same-sex weddings or ordination, and are we supposed to interrogate every single person about where they're, okay, sit down and state your beliefs, and we'll make sure that they match up with this congregation, and then get out, or whatever else. Whereas there's a lot more security, and I think, you know, truth to saying, rather, this is a place where, what defines us as Christian is the things that we do. And I think we're losing some of that a bit in favor of a more um, defining congregations basically based on cultural identity or political identity, especially in progressive churches. I serve a more progressive church. I think there's a tendency to say oh, well, our liberal or conservative politics are the thing that we bring into Christianity and then go out from. How do you think practices help us resist those temptations, or even reset that whole conversation?
That's a really good question, because I do see that, and you can see that with a lot of with churches sort of right and left, or with different cultural identities. And I think one of the good things about having a fairly robust practical theology of the sacraments and of worship, let's say, is that it does give people a ground on which they can transcend some of those differences. Now, by no means all of them. I'm a ELCA Lutheran, which means that I'm part of the, by some measures, the whitest denomination in America. And that's not who we are globally. That's not even who we necessarily are historically. There are contingent reasons that we are, as European American as we are, that do not have to do with the deep structure of Lutheran theology. There's huge Lutheran churches in Ethiopia and in all parts of the world, but that culturally, we are very centered in a kind of white, Northern European descended, suburban, middle class culture, which is the sort of thing that one can mistake for being universal. So it is very difficult to transcend that. But even there, I think having a sense of what we do together helps, because it will be people from a different background who have an experience with the practice will be able to engage in a way that I don't know how many places have Luther League anymore, but there are these very folk specific things that we used to have, and so that is hard work for us, and we have not been good at that, as much as we've wanted to emphasize it at a national level. But I do think when you're looking at things like politics, I have served, I would say, politically diverse congregations for, the last 9 years almost, and that's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge, but you can always give people a way to be Christian that does not require them to accept a lot of things they don't believe about who the president is at the time. Now, the downside to that is that you can be evasive and cowardly on important questions. I'm sure I have been, and I've also gotten in some scrapes when I've tried hard not to be. And people will hear you out. In my experience, people will bear with their church and their leaders more when they're saying things they don't necessarily want to hear, if there is a kind of robust sense of identity that goes beyond, we're all people who don't like Brett Kavanaugh, or we're all people who do like Brett Kavanaugh, or whatever it may be.
Right.
And that is, it is a challenge, but I do think that if you explicitly kind of root your congregational or whatever religious identity in something beyond that, you give people a place to be together when everything else might be keeping them apart.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways, to me, I mean, you and I have had online conversations about, it's so funny, actually, it's now hitting me that we're having this conversation about online communion and the validity of sacraments, and you and I have never shared the same physical space. We just met through Twitter and through your
Right.
book, and so I think it's interesting that you and I have talked a lot about missions, and I think that the activities that churches have taken on historically, I think especially in an effort to kind of find some practice that they can agree upon, even in the midst of political or ideological or cultural diversity, that there's something about sort of a top-down approach to charity that, or even global missions maybe, that can be that unifier and can be centered as maybe the main identity in a lot of practice, more
Mhm.
so than communion. I think when I talk to, people who I've served in ministry about how, what defines their communities, typically the first thing they mention are like the service projects that they
Yep.
do. And I think that it's interesting to think about ways that the coronavirus or climate change, as it continues to build, or even just, sort of the deterioration of, some social safety net things in the United States that we've seen in the past 40 or 50 years, how those things challenge what, you know um, I think maybe the effectiveness, but also just kind of the worldview of missions that Christians have kind of glommed onto in America as the central part of our identity, rather than these worship practices. Um,
Absolutely.
so, I mean, what do you make of that, and what do you think? Um, yeah, let's just start there with one question. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, I think there are two ways that I've seen this. One on, let's call it uh, the on the sales side, so to say. What we had in, this may or may not be true in the UMC to the degree that it's true in the ELCA, my church body, but uh, with the suburbanization of the church during and after World War II, basically, when all the urban enclaves in the big cities went out to the suburbs, and a lot of the rural populations migrated to urban areas, metropolitan areas. With the suburbanization of the church, and with the thing the sort of rising tide of home values and professional incomes and so forth, um, you had a model of ministry that was based on providing certain kinds of goods for middle class, suburban, overwhelmingly white Americans. And so the identity of communities became rooted in practice, but in a certain kind of practice. We have the best programs, or we do things for our kids. We do Sunday school, we do
Mhm.
confirmation, we do mission trips for the youth, we do all these things. And that kind of supplants doctrine, liturgy, sacramental theology as an identity for a congregation. Because all that stuff kind of is what it is, but what really is going to matter in terms of building your base, your customer base, is going to be the quality of your children's programming, for example. And then that's kind of the sales side, if you will. On the production or the output side, um, it that does create a sense of mission, or a construction of mission, that is very much based on philanthropy,
Mhm.
on projects, programs, things that we can kind of put in an annual report. We gave away this much. We did that. We built this many things. We built this many houses with Habitat for Humanity. All that's very good. That's all good stuff to do. But there is something missing from that, and that gets exposed when the tide starts to roll back out, and all the home values and the professional jobs and so forth that have been propping these small business churches up, really suffer. And when we face the breakdown of intergenerational transmission of the faith,
Mhm.
and this model of growth that was based on attracting families, serving them and their children, letting the children kind of wander off, and maybe they'll come back when they have kids, but then you need more families. You always kind of need to be pulling in more people. You have a growth model that relies on people having more kids than they have, that relies on people having more housing wealth than they have. And so this whole model really got exposed. I mean, it was already in decline if you looked at it sort of, in the long-term trend. It's been in decline since the mid '60s, but it really hit hard, I think, after the housing collapse and the financial collapse in 2007, 2008, 2009. You really see church budgets, which are in this world a fairly good proxy for what a church is and does, really take a hit. And I think that has forced some reckoning about what it is that we're trying to do. But I don't think that is anywhere close to being complete. I think we are still needing to figure out what it means to be a church, a congregation, in a world where setting up the best programs and doing the most appealing and attractive ministries is not the way that you are going to assure your community's existence over time.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, but I think that having served as a youth minister and seeing that programming level, and but also being a pastor that's helped a congregation try to build some of those programs up, there kind of is this double-edged sword of like, thinking, okay, this is the model for how to get the church to a more secure place so that then it can think about other models, versus
Right.
this feeling of the fragility of that and of that model to begin with. Because I think that at some point it basically, what it comes down to is like, oh, okay, well then the choice that Christians are faced with is this notion of like, all right, let me go shopping for the church that best has the stuff that meets my needs. Meanwhile, there's this growing population of people who see that and think that's not for me at all. That has nothing to say to me. And typically they're lower income. I think depending on your area, racial minorities certainly feel that way. I think that, and I think even more obviously than race is some way, are people who are LGBT. I mean, I think that in the context that I serve, that what I hear a lot are people who are desperate for a church home, and yet can't find a place that's actually speaking to them and or interested in having them be a part, because they're aberrant from that norm in some way. And I think the other thing is that hopefully what people see is that that form of being church, I think sometimes we can normalize it to a point where we forget how deeply conditioned it is. We, like, if you ask John Wesley or Martin Luther, or what should I do for my children's program? They're going to look at you and say, what? I mean, so I think this notion of this is the way we have to do church, and especially when we see it, like, I think the other thing that is that it invites us into competition with a typical civic community program, like your local nonprofit who's also doing these same sort of things around a social justice issue, or I don't know, any number of like community organizations that kind of promise people the same thing. And so it gets back to this question of what defines Christians as having a special mission in the world, which is what we're claiming on Sundays.
Right. I mean, I think, and I don't have a great answer for that. I mean, if I did, I would have written a different book, and I would have, hopefully gotten paid a lot of money, and I'd be, speaking on big stages or whatever.
I think you'd probably be ignored if you had the
well, I mean that's probably true. I mean, but I mean, I think if there's a way to sort of seamlessly tie together the uh, corporate identity, mission, and sort of evangelistic sustainability, I haven't come across it. Excuse me. And and I have to I have to start, at least myself, from the idea that we're not going to compete with everything. I mean, I'm in a way I'm in a fortunate situation. My church is not tiny, but it's not big, and um, and it's not it doesn't have like a big endowment, but it is financially stable, and that allows us to try to do what we do well. And it takes away, but there's no sense that we will just be able to duplicate and therefore compete with whatever anyone else is doing. Whereas in this area, in Dallas, definitely going up through the north of the city into the suburbs, there are just gigantic churches that are really built on a kind of full service ministry model. And I do think that there has been a bit of a bubble because that idea that you are going to give people a Christian branded way to do whatever else they would be doing, is not that there's a runway with that, but you do need to transition that into something else. And so for us, being neither tiny nor big enough to be tempted to create a cafe and a recreation park or whatever, that we can just kind of slap Jesus on. We have to depict Christian living as something that happens for people all the time, wherever their work, their vocation puts them. That you do not need to come to our facility. You do not need to go to our branded activities. You do not need to send your children to a specific kind of school in order to be a Christian. You do need to live out your life with a kind of faithfulness and integrity, and we will try to help equip you to do that. But that will not, by and large, happen in the physical or programmatic confines of the church, right? It will really, you really have to give people responsibility for being the church, without programmatic supervision or sanction, and to really say, you are the baptized people of God when you are taking care of your kids, when you're changing a diaper, when you are teaching students, when you are cleaning the streets, when you are, working at Walgreens, whatever it may be. You are the body of Christ for the people around you. And I am very new at trying to cultivate that sensibility really deliberately. Part of what we've done in this last week or two has been doing the daily office, the Book of Common Prayer, more or less, on Facebook Live. And people will come in and watch it. It's like, oh, here's several times a day that we can just come in and pray. And I thought, why wasn't I doing that before? There was no reason I couldn't do that, 6 months ago.
yeah.
But I will admit to being kind of fairly new at trying to give people a Christian identity that is not tied to their participation in a program.
Mm.
But I do think that is part of the challenge. We have tried to capture so much consumer surplus. We've tried to capture so much time, so much money, so much volunteer effort, that we've lost track of the fact that most people are going to live most of their lives somewhere else. And we have to help them do that with faithfulness and with devotion.
Yeah, I mean I think that that's absolutely right, and I think that when we do, I think that when we do come together, uh, I think it has to be partly about saying, okay, I mean, this gets back to the notion of discipleship, right? That ultimately, maybe what Christians have to recapture is this sense of being like sent forth
Right,
um, by Christ into the world. I mean, certainly that there's so much about our present situation that it's like, okay, there's this prescribed time to be a Christian that we've all been used to having and fulfilling by entering a church at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Okay, well, if that gets taken away from us,
right,
um, and this kind of gets back to a conversation that some people in my context have been having about, oh, we can't do Easter when it's supposed to happen on April 12th.
right,
So when we all get back to being in person, can we do Easter then? Because there's only one prescribed time where it's valid to worship
right,
or to celebrate the Easter festival, and that's when we can all gather in this particular way. And I think that to me, well, actually, I want to ask you a question about this because I know that you're a big fan of Soren Kierkegaard. Um, what do you think he has to say about these questions? Because I know that his critique of the European church in the 19th century has always felt very relevant to me. So, I mean, if you were Soren Kierkegaard walking around America during the COVID pandemic, besides doing some really intense posting, what do you
right.
think? What do you think that he would have to offer to this conversation here? How would he challenge us?
That's a really good question, and it's funny. I haven't thought about it in that frame yet, and I think partly because Kierkegaard, as much as he mined the scriptures and theology, he wasn't all that interested in liturgy, as far as I can tell, unless there's stuff in the notebooks or whatever that I haven't come across. It's not. I mean, there are a few references where he'll say, this kind of gospel is not this understanding. If this is what Jesus is saying in the story, in the parable of building a tower, counting the cost of it, if that's all that Jesus is talking about, if when he says hate your mother and your father, if all that means is just be indifferent to them, then this is surely not something we're standing up for, and that's a reference to standing up for the gospel in churches, as he would have done. But the question of, I mean, I do think for the church, what we could learn or kind of hear from Kierkegaard right now would be the idea of renunciation. That you do have to surrender some things. You do have to renounce some hopes that might be religious, but that you experience in a very psychologically human kind of worldly way. And you need to trust on the other hand, or subsequently by virtue of the absurd, that Easter cannot happen in the way that it should or that we want, but that it will still happen in some way. And so for me, at least, where that would lead me is to think, we do not need to replicate Easter. We do not need to build a Potemkin Easter, in June or whatever. I don't have any idea how when we'll be able to move everything back to normal. I don't even know what normal will look like. To some extent, you need to let go of the idea that there will be a normal on the other end of this, where everything will just kind of reassemble. You need to let go of that. But what you hold on to in exchange is something that I don't know yet. I don't know, excuse me, what to say about that. Um, my folks, I think, have been assuming that we will probably Easter will happen when it happens, and they will be watching on their screens, and that makes me sad. But I also know that I can't just pause. I can pause the liturgical calendar, but should I?
Mhm.
Should we look at it that way, or should we look at it as one of those things that we need to be called beyond in our faith in some way? Not beyond celebrating Easter, but can we find this for ourselves, or can God give this to us in a way that we aren't necessarily looking for right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that notion of paradox is, um, and crisis is so important. I think,
Mhm.
especially maybe how Bart reads Kierkegaard more, but I think that um, one of the things I like about him is his insistence on calling people to think about their faith as like, very sort of, I don't want to. I mean, weakly held in some ways. There's that
Right.
image he has of like floating. Faith is like floating on top of water, but like you're in the middle of the ocean. it's not.
Right.
It's not like, oh, if you try to put your feet down, there's solid rock there.
Right. There isn't anything there. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
and I
chasm. It's a leap over a chasm, and there's no net.
yeah, and I think that this is I think on some level, as I've been pondering the 2020 election and sort of the different, now to get political, but if I was thinking about, okay, how is the church, what are the political conditions that will allow the church to continue riding the sort of train that it's been on, um, from the 60s that we described, this programmatic model that we've had. And to me, it seemed clear that like the only way to do that would be like for all of this generational wealth to be redistributed that empowered our generation and the next one to live a more stable life.
Right.
Um, for the social safety net that created that prosperity in the 60s to be rebuilt.
Hmm.
And it seems that that's unlikely to happen. And even if it did, like the sort of economic transformation that would be required to stave off the worst of climate change, that would also be a major factor. But I think that in some ways, like what the coronavirus is teaching us is that even if we could, like, I think it's giving us a glimpse into what the church is going to be called to do and
Yeah.
the flexibility it's going to be required to come up with when it comes to fighting the climate crisis. But I think the other thing though is that hopefully it's also like freeing us from a lot of the sort of I don't know the right phrase for this, what the idiom is, but like, the storms and teapots that we create within the
Mhm.
daily life of churches for pastors and for congregants. Like I think that what this is teaching me as a pastor is that pastoral care is far more important than I'm not that I like realize, but that there can never be that the sort of relationship that people want with their pastor is a well that kind of has no bottom, right? Like
Right.
you're not going to like hit a quota on the
Hmm.
number of phone calls you can make and now everybody's sated or something like that.
Right. Right.
And I think that those things, I don't know, I think that without that kind of relationship, we'll never be into a place where um, the programs become less important than
Right.
that daily life, because I think it's there in those spaces where people can be truly honest about the things from their life that they'd like to bring into church. And then if they can't bring those things in, then how are we ever going to give them the gospel to carry back out, to
Right.
meet those problems? And I think in some ways, a lot of millennials see that, they see the fighting about, carpet color or about
Hmm.
same-sex marriage and or about, moral cultural debates from the 1980s or the 1960s and say, but those things are not affecting me. This other
Right.
stuff that churches won't talk about is what I want to talk about, and yet there's not a place
Right.
where I can do that.
Right. Well, and in as much as I experience sort of signs of hope on this, that is where it comes from. That when a church is willing and able, I dislike the phrase "meet people where they are" because it doesn't. I don't think it says too much and not enough at the same time. But when a church is able to be honest, I prefer to put it that way, maybe, to be honest about what it understands the gospel to be and what it understands its mission to be, that creates the basis for being able to talk to people who do not necessarily look at themselves as, oh, well, I'm a Lutheran, so I'll just find the closest Lutheran church, um,
Yeah.
or whatever, or the closest Lutheran church that also has the programs that I want. And I don't want to make too much of that, but I think, you mentioned Kierkegaard. I think the thing that probably haunts me most about him, well, everything does, but is the idea of the contemporaneity of the gospel and of Christ. That this is that do not put a barrier of 20 centuries between you and these events and say, okay, well, we've got the safety of retrospect sorting this out for us, and now all we have to do is live in our present time with all of the kind of buffer that creates. To say instead, to understand instead that this is now. And the thing about that, with a literal plague, with literal, dispossession as it happens in kind of Old Testament stories, is to know that the history never stopped. The sort of the pause that we had culturally in my kind of segment of the church for 60 years was not a real thing. And now it's been exposed as having been unreal, and we are in the middle of it. We are in the middle of upheavals that will remake the world we live in, and our job cannot be to try to cling to an old model, and it will not be to be a revolutionary vanguard, but we do need to do something that is neither nostalgic nor in denial, nor sort of gleeful. We've got to try to protect people, and I think that's hard because there isn't a good recent template for that in my world, but it's something that we will have to find a way to do, because it's not like the storm passes and then everything is smooth sailing again. That's just not going to happen. Not in our economy, not in our political institutions, not in our climate, not in anything else.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, I've certainly been a person who's been um, accused before of searching for signs of revolution. But I think that, and especially when I think about like the early 1900s and what the Methodist Church was doing, then, we came up with the social creed that then got turned into the National Council of Churches that
Mhm.
I always have my congregants recite on Labor Day weekend, where it talks about, we believe in a living wage and an end to child labor and a 40-hour work week and stuff like that. Like that, the Methodist Church wrote that as like a statement of belief because it was out in the world fighting on behalf of its congregants who needed those things.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that people now see those things as so unrelated to their faith.
Right.
Um, and also I think, and yet at the same time deeply related, because we haven't even scratched the surface of people like Dave Ramsey who are out there doing like Financial Peace University, and
Right.
I mean that's a whole another several hours long conversation, so it's tough to bring that in here as we approach the hour long mark. But I think that that when we're talking about like what is real life for people and how can the gospel speak into it, it's a question of where are people being crucified in our
Right.
society right now.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
it seems like at the heart of or at the height of the mainline sort of um, kind of cultural dominance in the United States, they were able to tap into answering that question. And then, the United Methodist Church sprouted off all these institutions that now we see in decay.
Right.
Either that or they've learned how to sustain themselves outside of kind of their relationship with the church.
Right. Right.
Um, so, Duke University started as this Methodist college, and yet now has a very little. I mean, they're Harvard and Princeton and
Right.
everything else. So I think that some of these questions that we're facing are about, how does the church, um, reach into wherever, whatever context it, the needs of people today, like the crucifixions that are going on today, to preach resurrections in those places. And somehow I think that's going to be closer to the mark than, um, kind of the model that we're seeing now on its last breath.
Mhm. Right. If I think if there's something that for me ties together the liturgical and sacramental piece of ministry with the social, social ministry or social doctrine side of it, it's that idea of solidarity, of fairly literal human bodily solidarity, in which is represented in a kind of idealized way in the liturgy. God's solidarity with humanity, our solidarity with each other in the body of Christ, but that then kind of meets the rubber meets the road in our vocations as Christians in the world, where we have to find a way to practice that and to preach that. That it will not be a matter of us, suburban mainline congregation with the education and the wealth and the resources who will benevolently do things for other people. It will be us experiencing the crises ourselves in varying degrees and needing to help each other, help stand up for each other, and by extension for everyone else who is going to be bearing the brunt of these massive changes. And I think that's, for me, that's where I find it kind of tied together. It isn't that the church forms us in a certain way and then we go and apply it. It's that the church really does model and represent what the world is: crucifixion and resurrection.
Mm.
um, and we are all a part of that, whether we know it or not. And so our task as Christians is to reveal that in our lives in a different way for the people around us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it took us an hour to get there, but I think that right there is the sort of the statement of this conversation. And I think what we've been searching for, that the nature of the world. I mean, this makes me think of Terry Eagleton, where he talks about the history of the world as one like long crucifixion.
Right.
Or that being the truth of the world of human
Mm-hmm.
existence, and Christ stepping into that truth. That's what an
Right.
incarnational theology looks like, is that, and I think that, the church, I think we're seeing, it's not that those things aren't there. It's that, they've kind of been like, I want to say like a vampire that needs to be invited in, but that's kind of it. The
Right.
clergy have to invite their congregants to bring in the cross in their lives and to offer it
Right.
up at the table, to receive and participate in that, to know that solidarity of Jesus. And I think that this gets back to something that I've learned about preaching, and I think that a lot of seminarians and you know a lot of young pastors right now need to kind of really search for, do some self-searching about, is that there's a difference in preaching the Bible, as Jesus speaking against your congregation, and Jesus speaking from within your congregation. Blessed are the poor. I've always been in ministry contexts where there weren't any poor people socioeconomically present in the building. So it's easy to use that as a lance to kind of say, you know, wealth is killing us or whatever like that.
Right.
But there's a deeper level. The church will never be a church of the poor if we never hear those texts as saying, Jesus saying in those spaces, blessed are the poor because I'm there with them.
Right.
Um,
Right.
because that's where I am.
Right.
And I think that, I think that a lot of that, I don't know, it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you only ever preach to those who are wealthy within your context, then the people who are not aren't going to hear a message for them.
Aren't going to hear a message.
They already know that wealth inequality sucks and that people should be
Right.
sorry about it.
Right.
They already know.
Right.
I mean, I think that this is a big thing for the church, is that, people are already deeply aware of its hypocrisies.
Right. And that it is in some ways unreal,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And I think if you preach the real and you do the real, that will you have to kind of trust that will um, unfold in some way.
Yeah.
And I think uh, in a way the cultural distance, that Kierkegaard wanted to kind of collapse between the first century and our age, is one that doesn't feel as distant anymore, and even as it did when I started all this. I started seminary in 2004, and there was the Iraq War. There was all the things going on there that were certainly very theologically significant, but that did not map onto the stories of land enclosure or of dispossession and so forth, that would be really relevant only a few years later, and that are still, ongoing now. And so I think you have to preach that, and you have to practice that, and you can't be responsible for all of the consequences. I mean, you can't. You kind of have to put it out there and just see what the world says back.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ben, I think this is probably a good place to put a pin in all this, but I want to say thank you for showing up, for having this conversation. Is there anything you'd like to share with people, how they can find your book, how they can find some of your writing?
Yeah, well, there's links to a lot of what I've written and to my book at bendueholm.com. I don't have any copies of my book that aren't defaced right now, so I can't show it. But if you search for Sacred Signposts in books on Amazon or at any other bookseller, you can find it. I appreciate people who read and who get in touch.
Yeah, well, we'll put some links to those things in the video description, and I'll share
Excellent.
the link to our conversation with you as well in case you want to pass it around.
I will do that.
And us in Charlottesville will be praying for your community in Dallas as we continue to
Thank
move
you.
through this season.
We'll do the same for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Take care.